The Second World War has finished. However, the victorious Allies are increasingly dividing themselves into two separate spheres. On one half, we have the United States and the West. On the other side, we have the Soviet Union and the East. These two rivals have found themselves in a fierce competition, each vying for technological gains, military power, and worldwide influence. Now the two greatest powers of the world, the US and the USSR, are about to engage in a new kind of war. The space race has begun. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite into orbit around the Earth. It marked the start of the space race, a heated competition for technological supremacy between the US and Soviet Union.
Sputnik truly had a profound effect on everyone around the world. Its name Sputnik meant traveling companion.
Everyone makes a really big deal about how Sputnik was the first satellite and it marked the start of this huge air exploration, but truthfully, it was barely as big as a beach ball, and all it did was send random, meaningless signals back to Earth.
Despite its rather mundane use, people around the world, and especially in the US, were shocked to find out that a nation of seemingly poor, backwards farmers could reach such a monumental milestone.
What a lot of people didn't realize at the time was that the Russians specifically made the satellite to show off to the world the power of the Soviets. It was designed in a way that made it unmistakably noticeable. Despite its rather small size, it was created to be extremely shiny so that it would reflect light, be seen with the naked eye, and be sure to catch attention.
And catch attention it did. Numerous newspaper articles popped up around the world, some in awe, others in disbelief, and yet others were left horrified. This European newspaper article by Daniel F. Gilmore and this New York Times paper both released the day after the launch. With the launch of Sputnik, the Soviet Union was launched ahead while the United States was left to pick up the pieces. It now seemed that the US was falling behind in science and that soon the communists would launch more satellites and possibly drop nukes from space. In response, America experienced a renewed interest in education, and scientific and mathematical institutions sprang up across America. President JFK pursued this newfound interest when he stepped up to presidency.
The launch of Sputnik really hit a soft spot in people's hearts all over America. The knowledge that the Soviets had beaten them to it was something they just could not face. And this marked what pretty much can be called a revolution in scientific education all over America, which was actually much needed at the time.
Once the space race began, the Cold War tensions between the US and the Soviet Union greatly deepened.
They both engaged in intense competition. Both wanted to be the first in everything.
It was a matter of national security, and a symbolic of technological and ideological superiority, especially for the US, because they thought the Soviets had the upper hand.
Although the armies of the US and Soviet Union never fought directly, the two countries were in constant economic, military, and technological competition, each seeking to outdo the other. The two countries sought to gain allies across the world, further their political ideologies, and undermine the power of their rivals. During the Cold War, the US and its allies has created a democratic, pro-Western government with a capitalist economy in West Germany, while the Soviets established East Germany, which had a pro-Soviet, communist government.
The events in Germany were just one example of the greater conflict. From 1945 to 1991, the Cold War, with the help of the space race, dominated international affairs with numerous proxy wars, propaganda sprees, and the constant threat of nuclear war.
After the successful launch of Sputnik, Nikita Khrushchev decided to build another satellite to commemorate the date of the Russian Revolution on November 3, 1957. On board was the first living creature in space, Laika. She was the first dog in space.
At first, the Soviets actually trained 3 stray dogs to go on the mission, and all 3 of them did well on the conditioning, but they chose Laika to go on Sputnik 2.
Unfortunately, during the mission, Laika died in orbit due to overheating within the vessel. Although from the start of the mission, the Soviets knew Laika was condemned to die in space. They had created a plan to send her into space, but never bothered to find a way to bring her back.
The reason why they didn't bring Laika back was partly because of the short time period given to them by Khrushchev to build the second Sputnik. He was too obsessed with the rivalry between the United States and overlooked what he thought to be trivial matters like the death of a stray dog. Others, however, suspected the Soviets didn't really care about how animals were treated. The US used this against the Soviet Union, sparking animal rights protests around the world. They accused them of being inhumane and vowed to remember Laika's accomplishments.
The purpose of Sputnik 2 and Laika's mission was to see if living things could successfully be sent into space, and the initial success of the launch was an important first step in sending human beings into space. Horrified at the thought of falling behind the Russians, the United States quickly accelerated its own space program. On December 6, 1957, the US unveiled its answer to Sputnik. Vanguard, the rocket, carried a satellite similar to Sputnik and was prepared to show the world that America refused to fall behind in technology. However, as the rocket began to rise in the air, it was quickly consumed in flames and crumpled on the launch platform. Ironically, the satellite it carried survived the explosion, rolled along the ground, and obediently began to beep.
The failure of this mission, which the public dubbed Flopnik, further illustrated American inferiority in space and rocket technology.
This failure of the Americans sparked immense media coverage. As can be seen in this newspaper article from the Daily Herald, the failed mission was seen as a shameful turn of events for America's space endeavors. America failed to reach space until almost 2 months later, on January 31st, 1958, when Explorer 1 was launched. It was significantly more advanced than Sputnik, and for a time the US and USSR remained neck and neck in the space race. Then, suddenly, in April 10th, 1961, the Russians sent the first man into space. The launch of Yuri Gagarin into space once again confirmed Soviet scientific domination over the United States. The mission was a complete success, with Yuri Gagarin orbiting the Earth in Vostok 1 and safely descending back to Earth. This achievement was a massive propaganda victory for communists everywhere, and once again the United States found itself behind the Soviet Union. This success caught even more attention from the media. This Soviet newspaper is just one such example. Fearful of Soviet intentions, the US quickly followed up with Freedom 7 on May 5, 1961. In it was Alan Shepard, the first American and second human in space. Freedom 7 was part of Project Mercury, which has commenced on October 7, 1958, exactly 1 year and 3 days after the Soviets launched Sputnik 1. The success of Freedom 7 helped to restore American confidence in NASA and the space program. The goals of these flights were to have a human in orbit around the Earth, to see what mankind can do in space, and to recover both the spacecraft and persons safely. The Mercury Atlas 6 was the first to accomplish this goal on February 20, 1962. After Project Mercury, Project Gemini was beginning to form. In 1965 to 1966, there were 10 more manned flights. This time, the goal was to make advanced space travel to the moon.
The Mercury program laid the building blocks for Project Gemini and the Apollo mission. It led the way toward the giant leap for mankind, the first man on the moon.
On May 25, 1961, American President John F. Kennedy made a speech before a joint session of Congress. In it, he talked about his goals for America in space.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
Kennedy never supported space exploration the way Khrushchev did. He actually thought it was quite a waste of money, but he still felt compelled to take America forward in all aspects. I remember in a speech he made at Rice University, he said, "No nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space."
Also around this time, Kennedy approached Nikita Khrushchev twice about a joint venture into space. Once in 1961 and the second in autumn of 1963. He declined both times. However, on July 21, 1969, the Apollo mission finally succeeded in landing mankind on the moon. the Americans had officially beaten the Soviets. With the Americans landing men on the moon and establishing themselves as the leaders of spaceflight, the space race began to wind down. Gone were the days of patriotic fervor of Sputnik, Yuri Gagarin, and Neil Armstrong. The United States and Soviet Union began to look inward, and general enthusiasm about space began to wane. However, despite the reduced tension, competition between the two powers remained, as can be seen in a new phase of the space race, the space stations. Despite America's smashing success in the Apollo missions, the Soviets turned to the idea of sending people onto long-term missions into space. The first prototype of structures such as Mir and the International Space Station was Salyut 1. Launched in April 19, 1971, Salyut 1 was 12 meters long and about 4.1 meters wide, and was intended to study the long-term effects of space on the human body. Unfortunately, the project failed after the crew of 3 died upon re-entry. Not wanting to fall behind the Russians after their recent successes, the U.S. quickly organized its own space station program. Named Skylab, it was launched on May 14, 1973, and orbited until 1979.
During its operational history, Skylab allowed astronauts to conduct various experiments in space, and most importantly, study the long-term impact of outer space on the human body.
The final hurrah of the Soviet space program before the collapse of the USSR in 1991 was Mir. Started in 1986, Mir was the largest space station ever built until the construction of the International Space Station in 1998.
It signified the end of the Cold War with the joint unification efforts of the US and Russia.